Thank you all so much for joining. Today, we have a very, very special guest with us today. Her name is Miss Gabby, and she does a lot of work that she's going to tell you guys about in pertaining to environmental science and things of that nature. For those of you who don't know, my name is Shakira Jackson. I am currently an intern for CFACT. Basically, a little bit about CFACT. Their mission statement is pretty much self-explanatory, in regards to environmental science, helping the earth, things of that nature. And some of the four components that we tend to stand by is basically the prospering of lives. So basically CFACT works to help people find better ways to provide for food, water, energy, and things of that nature. Also promoting progress. CFACT advocates for the use of safe, affordable technologies and the pursuit of economic policies that basically reduce the pollution and waste that we're currently seeing. We also work on protecting the earth. So that looks like CFACT helps protect the earth through WISE, basically trying to promote a very good lifestyle for land life, for wildlife, etc. Also providing education. CFACT educates a lot of different folks, specifically with me. I am currently an intern, so my job for you guys is to just inform you of the situations that are occurring in our environment today. And basically, yeah, that's a little bit about CFACT. CFACT stands for the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow. And, it was founded by two gentlemen who, really came up with this idea to really help the environment. There's so many people that we have now involved in the organization who are just working to get the real news out there, because there's a lot of fake news that are going on right now in our society today. And it's just really important for us to stay more involved and to help our environment while we still can. So I am going to shut up now and let the expert of tonight take it away. Miss Gabby, whenever you are ready, please feel free to introduce yourself. And yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me, Shakira. And I look forward to addressing your group. Here is kind of what I'm going to explain for you all in a nutshell. I'm going to talk about the future of American environmentalism, and I'll explain a little bit about my background. I'll talk about kind of the two warring philosophies of environmentalism, the two strains that constantly butt heads with one another. I'll cite some interesting examples about what is happening on the environmental front with a new administration coming in, kind of what their policies look like so far, any challenges to their policies. And I'll also conclude with kind of an overview as to how to get people involved in the environment or conservation without necessarily scaring them or telling them that everything is ending, but effective ways for people to be involved. So a little bit about me. I handle communications for CFACT. I've been working with them on and off for about 2 years. I've helped them with different types of responsibilities. I've been responsible for congressional outreach on Capitol Hill. I host a Conservation Nation series with them, and I just returned from Florida to film a few episodes with them down there, which was really exciting. I like to look for the confluence between different industries and environmental stewardship. So that's the gist of the series. And if you have questions about that, I'll answer that at the end of the lecture. I have also had CFACT come on board and support my podcast, which is called District of Conservation, kind of a play on District of Columbia, the moniker there, DC. I wanted something to kind of roll off the tongue. And I launched it before I kind of got heavily involved with CFACT, but they decided to sponsor my podcast, and it's a great synergy there as well. And I talk about public policy issues related to hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy issues, stewardship, what's happening in and around DC. I interview the who's who kind of in politics and the outdoors and many others out there. And I really like what I do. I also write about these issues at townhall.com, which is a center-right publication, but I also don't necessarily just write about politics. I try to do some storytelling pieces there. I also am someone who is directly involved in different issues relating to the outdoor industry, hunting, fishing, shooting sports, even environmentalism. So some of my original reporting has allowed me to be in consideration for different awards. And about 2 years ago, I won an award for original reporting about the grizzly bear issue out west. And that was a fun subject to cover. It's reared its head up again in discourse right now. This past week, there's a bill to kind of help return management of the grizzly bear, which is fully recovered to the states. And I myself I guess I consider myself a conservationist. I have fished since I was a little girl. I'll talk about how kind of firearms play into this component, how you can be funding conservation through guns and ammunition, but I'm also a gun owner. And for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been hunting. And I'll talk a little bit about hunting as a means of conservation, because actually a lot of the excise taxes collected on licenses, along with guns and ammunition, go back to conservation funding. So I'm someone who lives, eats, and breathes this, not only from a reporting standpoint, but someone who also loves and enjoys the outdoors. Kind of a new view of what an environmentalist is. You often hear about environmentalists being one way or looking one way, but actually environmentalists and conservationists can look very different and be very diverse. So what I'll talk about, kind of what I alluded to, is kind of an overview of where environmentalism stands. I'll talk about the differences between preservation and conservation, and I'll touch upon current events. So what's the state of environmentalism today? I alluded to earlier when I began that it's kind of a war between two philosophies. So you have this kind of prevailing environmentalism that has been there for a long time, kind of elevated by different administrations across the years, called preservationist environmentalist philosophy. So that basically means that there should be limited human impact on natural settings. So things should be preserved, kind of closed off for different activities. It means largely focusing on moving away from kind of multiple use, balanced use of public lands, not exploring public lands so much, kind of putting in some government regulations to preserve, and kind of putting on different restrictions for land use to kind of make it harder for people to use land for consumptive uses. And I would say kind of an insurgent philosophy is conservation. And sometimes people use these terms interchangeably. Some people, I would say, use conservation in the wrong light, because conservation is about stewarding the land. It also can entail limited government or kind of free market tenants, and it largely empowers individuals as well. And conservation and preservation often get intertwined and confused with one another. Very simply, of course, people like to hijack different terms and say, well, this is conservation and nothing else can be conservation. But conservation calls for, you can have responsible, sustainable management of natural resources or lands or species, where you do require a little bit of culling or a little bit of management, or allowing for industry or people to use, let's say, public lands for multiple uses. So it's important to know the differences between the two. And I forgot to mention that preservation, largely, you have government kind of taking the charge. Government is largely behind a lot of the decisions. It comes in and it kind of acts as a mediator. It doesn't really welcome stakeholder input so much, although some of them now today do call for that. However, typically it's government that kind of has a top-down approach for environmental policies and regulation, and it doesn't really create opportunities for people outside of government unless you're somewhat aligned with them. But that's what it is kind of in a nutshell, and I'll explain a little bit more. According to National Geographic, preservation protects the environment from harmful human activity. So that's what I kind of alluded to. And you'll see this a lot with sometimes different land designations. So wilderness area designations, you'll see this with, and I'll talk about this more, about limiting development of oil and gas on federal public lands. You see this as also in the form of sometimes no management of forests. That's kind of something we've seen with preservation recently. There's another policy that is emerging to section off 30% of public waters and public lands to any activity, and that can harm actually public access for different activities in the future, despite having kind of an amiable goal. But yeah, that's kind of what preservation does. Like I said, it limits human activities. So a lot of things are sectioned off, sometimes to the detriment of public users of public lands, unfortunately. But that's kind of what preservation is in a nutshell. What preservation can be defined by, and you don't necessarily have to agree with this, but I view, and I think a lot of people kind of view preservationist environmentalism as defined by these tenets. Obviously, it's not always the case, but typically in recent years, this is what it's become largely defined by. Alarmism and somewhat of anti-capitalist attitudes, You have kind of the selective exploration of energy sources. You see people being okay with solar and wind, not oil and gas traditionally, but there's also kind of no discussion of nuclear, which is disappointing. Sometimes policies relating to preservation can unfortunately lead to limiting people's access to public lands, like I said, with national monument designations, which I haven't talked about, but I can talk about, and also sometimes with wilderness areas, and even with national park designations. You can visit national parks, obviously, but in terms of recreational activities, you're kind of limited as to what you can and cannot do. Sometimes with preservationist philosophy, you have a demonization of individuals who steward the land and even private entities. Like I said, it kind of goes back to kind of anti-capitalist attitudes. And oftentimes, lately, especially with our return to the Paris Accords under this new administration, you see kind of our foray back into global non-binding treaties with very unserious yet big polluters. So we are now, and I'll talk more about this, and if you have questions about why kind of entry into the Paris Climate Accords really won't do so much for our emissions goals, we've been meeting those goals and using cleaner energy, we became energy independent. But you often see kind of this preservationist philosophy, people signing on to these treaties, which are kind of null and ineffective, especially with few people participating and contributing, kind of a reliance on the United States to be in it, and then no one else does their share of lowering emissions. So that's kind of what preservation is defined by. Conservation, alternatively, is conservation protects the environment through the responsible use of natural resources. It's also known as stewardship. And it is often defined by individuals, private interests, leading efforts. I forgot to add, but this is something I want to be keen on adding. You can have public-private partnerships, and we did see that a lot in the last administration, believe it or not. Oftentimes, conservation is also marked by balanced use, multiple sustained yield management of public lands. So it allows not only people to recreate on public lands, it also gives people the opportunity to have a lifestyle off public land. So if you're in timber, if you're in ranching, if you're in cattle grazing and farming, if you run an outfitting business, you can also benefit from multiple use sustained yield management of public lands philosophy and kind of the issues that are out there. This is really largely common out west, because much of the public lands that people consume and people access are out west. About 99% of public lands are west of the Mississippi. And you often see with conservation, greater cooperation between government, landowners, conservationists, industry players, and kind of bringing everyone to the table. And that's what a lot of people in media, what I noticed, failed to kind of underscore with the last administration. They were kind of focused on different policies, not so much on kind of what actions were being taken, just because I felt like they had a lot of agenda items that they were beholden to. But having interacted with different administration officials, I spoke to the former Interior Secretary, some of their staff. I got to see kind of beyond the veil of what the media was portraying, that they were actually doing their best to advance conservation, however imperfect, but they were working really hard to do so. But that's kind of what it is in a nutshell. Now, there's often a debate as to who contributes more to conservation. Is it, let's say, the hikers and campers who really talk a great deal of being great environmentalists, stewards of the land? And granted, there are many who do care and who do, I would say, have an input, and they care and they give back to conservation. But when you break down kind of funding mechanisms and information, the evidence actually has pointed to the fact that conservationists are largely those who go hunting and fishing. And the graphic that I posted, a screenshot of a very pertinent, interesting article that had a lot of discussion in the outdoor industry, even among environmentalists, was that the decline of hunters can actually threaten how the United States pays for conservation. And we've seen, we've seen a lot of articles actually in the last year because of COVID come out by Washington Post, Pew Research Center, or Pew Trust, their kind of nonprofit arm, with, if we don't have hunters replenish kind of conservation funding, if we don't have active participants who go fishing and hunting, these funds and revenues are going to dry up. And actually, the most recent funding information that became available from the Fish and Wildlife Service last month was that excess tax programs reaped about $1.1 billion from conservation funding that came from excise taxes largely collected on guns ammunition, hunting, and fishing licenses through the Pittman-Robertson Fund, which is a law that was passed in 1937 to create a system where conservationists can actually help fund the different projects and the different programs to sustain wildlife populations, to put in restoration efforts of wildlife and habitat restoration efforts as well. And there's a program within that law called the Wildlife and Sport Fishing Restoration Programs, through which all this money is divvied up and distributed. And a lot of people have been talking about this. And if you need clarification, this is the first time you're seeing this and you're like, whoa, this is so interesting, or whoa, I had no idea. I'm happy to elaborate more in Q&A about this. But a lot of people have started to recognize that people who they may be miscategorized as harmful to the environment, or people who they kind of viewed as not responsible stewards of the land or responsible stewards of the country or our natural resources. I've seen a lot of people kind of retract their attacks on hunters and anglers recently, and it's amazing. And kind of give them more kudos and recognize, oh, there is a connection between all these people. But while that is the case, there are people who do contribute privately and who don't necessarily go hunting and fishing. But it is important to note that hunters and anglers do help pay a good chunk of conservation funding in this country. And this is kind of the mechanism that accomplishes that. So what is environmentalism going to look like under this new administration? So I had talked earlier about preservation or conservation, what we're largely going to see. Having kind of observed what the pre-Trump administration did, what Obama's administration did, and they were largely preservationists. They had a few good things related to wildlife. I was actually really surprised when they released studies finding that gray wolves and grizzly bears had to be delisted. Probably one of the few items I agreed with them, because science could supersede politics, but their wildlife biologists concluded that certain species that were previously threatened or endangered had to be removed from the Endangered Species Act and be managed by the states. But I would say this is kind of what we see so far from Biden's administration is kind of a return to the Obama administration, except for a few differences. Obama's administration actually had people who were tied to oil and gas, and I wouldn't say that's a bad thing. But his administration, especially those who are advising Biden, who was Obama's vice president, have said, we don't want anyone who has any ties to oil and gas working in the administration. And they want to have that, that's their choice. However, a lot of people who are returning, I would say, to government, you have Obama's EPA director, Gina McCarthy, who is a climate advisor, John Kerry, who is also formerly the Secretary of State, but he's really adamant about solving climate change. However, he's a bit of a hypocrite when it comes to it. He recently started to travel coach flying, but he has statements about some of his advocacy have come out, and kind of the hypocrisy about he encourages people not to travel for curbing global emissions, yet he himself was like, well, I was able to travel. I think it was to Iceland. A clip came out a few weeks ago or a month or two ago where it showed that he said he can justify traveling and, you know, exhausting all these different emissions. However, anyone else, if they try to do that, they're doing horrible ruin to the environment. So you see kind of fixtures from past administrations, past preservationist administrations returning. The new Interior Secretary, while she is a very historic candidate, she's the first Native American to lead the agency. There was previously a Native American at the #2 position for Department of Interior, and he was actually considered as part of the nomination process, but ultimately Biden decided to go with Secretary Holland, now Secretary Holland. However, Holland was scrutinized in her confirmation hearing for being very anti-oil and gas, even though oil and gas actually does play a role in conservation, and I'll explain a little bit about that more. She was a Green New Deal sponsor, so people were worried naturally about some of her extreme positions creeping into kind of her new role in Interior. If she is to kind of moderate some of her positions, maybe some of the criticism wielded towards her will subside, but she had a lot of her positions questioned, and rightfully so. And a lot of people, where much of the public lands lie out west, had questions for her. And you also see a little bit with the new EPA administrators and energy secretaries and other related appointees or cabinet members kind of adhere to preservationist policies, although they are kind of really keen on solar and wind exploration on public lands. And I'll talk about the tussle between some of their more allies and them, and how that could actually be a conflict down the road. But that's kind of a glimpse into Biden's administration so far. what we can already determine or kind of see so far going on, you will see lawsuits challenged very early on in this administration, especially in wake of the Keystone Pipeline, which got different, I would say, green light from the past administrations. From the Obama administration, it passed different tests of muster. It was deemed environmentally friendly. The owner of, or the person behind the project, said that there would be net zero emissions from it, and Biden decided in one of his early executive orders to cancel it. And then I think also the pipeline organizer also withdrew the contract as well. So the project remains in the air. More recently, we've seen Western states starting to sue oil and gas moratorium executive orders that came down from the Biden administration so far. And I talked a little bit about this, but there's also going to be some schisms and issues among kind of this preservationist environmentalist philosophy, what you see in government and kind of in the activist circles, kind of with different interests kind of butting heads. So one article I saw in the Los Angeles Times was the fact that over the construction of some new wind turbines in California, Big Wind, as they're called, has said that they would privately breed the endangered and threatened California condor. And that has upsetted a lot of bird conservationists because that'll deter their efforts. They're worried that a lot of birds have been decimated because of wind turbines and different wind projects. So you'll see kind of that budding of species conservation and the need for developing clean energy. Moreover, in Bloomberg News, and I can send you guys the articles if you're interested, Bloomberg News pointed out a few weeks ago that in order for the United States to, let's say, construct or go full steam ahead with solar and wind, especially for solar projects, the United States relies on China for minerals needed to construct solar panels. So that has kind of raised some human rights issues, some concerns from an energy independence standpoint. So you'll see kind of these issues, I would say, percolate and kind of come about. So they're going to have to reckon with that, especially not only from critics who are on the opposite side of the aisle politically, but even among people in their own kind of environmentalist circles. So there's a lot of stuff happening with this new administration, and it's going to give people, I think, an opportunity who may not agree with all that they're doing or who oppose largely what they're doing. And CFACT is largely going to be opposing, I can say that comfortably, we're going to largely oppose what comes out of the Biden administration just because of just the speed with which they're pushing all these different executive orders. It doesn't seem like there's any input yet from true conservationists that they kind of want to satisfy some of their donors more so, but we could be proven wrong, of course. But this is kind of what you will anticipate and see. And I think you'll see a lot of conflict with respect to kind of different interests, different stakeholders all across the country, a lot of different industries that are going to feel left out or pigeonholed or attacked. But this is something you guys can mull over. And like I said so far, a little bit about what he's doing. So cumulatively, I would argue, even though we're really early into the Biden administration, I've so far witnessed that they're pushing largely preservationist and heavy-handed government or big government policies, obviously with one of the few executive orders to stop oil and gas leases onshore, on federal lands and also offshore. And with stopping future offshore oil and gas leases, that's going to affect a program called the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which was just permanently funded by the Great American Outdoors Act, a very successful bipartisan bill. And that program, which relies on offshore oil and gas royalties collected on excise taxes, federal royalties on oil and gas, that's going to create a conflict in terms of the funding mechanism there. So if we see this moratorium continue on new leases and even extend to perhaps existing leases, that's going to be really problematic. I also talked about are we joining the Paris Accords? According to some of the recent, I would say, reports about the Paris Accords, very few countries of the 190 some odd different signatories, only about, I would say about 20, slightly under 20 countries were actually meeting their Paris Accord emission standards and environmental requirements. And that goes to show that you don't really need to be in this agreement. The United States was actually meeting our threshold without being a part of the Paris Accords. We were actually lowering emissions significantly with our absence there. So it goes into question whether or not you really need to be part of this kind of Paris Accord agreement from the UN to really be an environmental steward or to really take your emissions crusade seriously. And the last few years proved that you didn't need to be. We were lowering emissions. But that's going to be kind of contentious to see like what our reentry does. Are we going to meet the standards? Are other countries going to meet the standards because we're in it now? I'm kind of doubtful that other countries will do it because they'll rely on us for doing stuff. It's kind of a virtual signaling move, and we won't see, I think, any immediate impact with other countries wanting to do their part. I think you're not going to see China lower its emissions. You're not going to see Russia lower its emissions. Same with India and some other countries that pollute far worse than us. So it'll be really interesting to see what that does. I think it's just a mere virtue signaling effort. I don't think you need to be part of some sort of larger conglomerate to be responsible with the environment, to lower your emissions. And that's what the last few years actually proved. Also, we became energy independent under the last administration because of the natural gas revolution. People mocked the previous energy or Trump's energy department about this, but they called natural gas, I would say, exports molecules of freedom. So we were exporting a lot of natural gas abroad, and we were becoming energy independent and cutting our reliance on different countries. And now you see, kind of with the cancellation of different pipelines, kind of the philosophy that has started to take fold in this new administration. And different reports have suggested we're going to start relying on foreign countries again for energy. And that's pretty disconcerting. Something that is kind of emerging in kind of hunting and fishing circles that I've observed, and I've seen this in different states, is the 30 by 30 biodiversity initiative to section off 30% of public waters and public lands. It sounds benign and perfect on the surface. I don't disagree with the aims of trying to make biodiversity stronger, to promote that. However, sometimes problems that come with a preservationist policy like this, and a reason why California, which had considered this bill, actually withdrew the bill and didn't vote on it, is because it lacked input from hunters and anglers who recreate on public lands and public waters. And the problem that a lot of people have with 30 by 30, although it is a Biden administration priority now, it doesn't include key input. And there are some issues where it will restrict recreational and or commercial use of, let's say, public water. So people who do commercial fishing, a lot of them have raised concerns with this, making it unfair for them, even if they abide by the rules. For hunters and anglers kind of domestically, there's great concern that they're not going to have an input, that it's going to make it increasingly difficult for them to access public lands or public waters, stemming off of certain laws that are in place in California, like Marine Land Protection Act. So you're going to hear more about that, and that's going to be something you will likely hear. And a lot of us have questions about it because it could have some consequences. It could actually limit out public access, despite promising to be kind of rooted in public access. So it has kind of a duplicitous meaning to it. So that's something to look out for as well. And then something that he's already done from an executive order standpoint, national monument designations, which if the presidential authority on national monument designations have been debated, and it's been long overdue since this law, which is called the Antiquities Act, from where it stemmed from, whether or not it's due for some congressional reform. So you're going to see whether or not national monument designations are going to be kind of restricted, if presidential authority is going to be restricted. I have no doubt we'll see that. And whether or not those designations actually increase public access for different public lands or restrict people. And in many states out west, several states out west have said that even with these designations at times, it does impede people's opportunities to go fishing and hunting or recreate at times. Same with wilderness areas. There was a bill that was voted on in the House, but the Senate hasn't voted quite yet on it. But you'll see, like I said, a lot of preservationist policies, and these are kind of a sampling of that. Now, I probably have inundated you guys with a lot of stuff. You may think I am crazy. Maybe you think what I have discussed is completely out of line. But if you agree, disagree, kind of find yourself in the middle on what I discussed, I think we can all agree to get people interested in environmental activism kind of from a even-keeled level. I want to present you guys with two interesting thought leaders that I have really grown to respect and admire in the kind of mainstream environmental movement, who kind of preach against, let's say, heavy-handed government or preservation or kind of alarmist rhetoric, which turns off people and actually gets them to not be interested in working to better the environment. But one book that I love, and if you love water activities, if you like fishing, you like surfing, you like being by the water, I cannot recommend this book enough. And this is by Dr. Wallace J. Nichols, and it's called The Blue Mind. And I won't read the quote for you guys, can absorb it for yourself, but he talks a lot about how your mind is at ease whenever you're by the water. And what I liked about this quote when I read this book last summer was that people don't respond to, let's say, data points. People don't like being told the world is ending because it tunes people out. When you tell people constantly they're to blame for stuff, or there's nothing they can do, or the apocalypse is on the horizon, it turns off a lot of people. So he concluded this quote by saying that the environmental movement, sadly, is scaring people, making them feel bad, and overloading them with data. So if you read this book, or you read kind of his musings, I think, and I believe he's definitely like a cookie cutter environmentalist. That seems to be his prevailing attitudes when you read the book. But he kind of departs from some of his colleagues where he understands, like, this is how you get people interested. So you have kind of a mainstream environmentalist, marine biologist, talking about how you can get people interested in the environment and get them to kind of put their mind at ease through water activities. So that's something I hope you can take away and read his book, or read what he talks about in terms of the blue mind and how to get people to incline themselves to water activities. But I really like what he has to say about environmentalism. Another person who you guys may have heard of, we've talked about him at CFACT a little bit, is Dr. Michael Schellenberger, who really was groomed in this kind of like preservationist, like climate change activism strain of environmentalism. And in the last few years, he has kind of, let's say, shied away from some of his past tendencies, where he said that environmentalism actually hurt, or alarmism of the environmental variety actually hurts the cause of the environment. And he says that the catastrophic framing of climate change is self-defeating because it alienates and polarizes many people, and exaggerating climate change risks distracts us from other important issues, including ones we might have more near-term control over. And this is from an article he wrote. And he authored this book called Apocalypse Never, kind of laying out all the different environmental crises that he views as important and something worth tackling. And he does say climate change is worth fighting, of course, but he says kind of the attention drawn to it detracts from deforestation, it detracts from combating other crises. And also he loves to talk about and is a very big advocate for nuclear energy, which he says is very safe. And he said he was previously kind of against it because of just what he was taught, but he's grown to become a really big advocate for it because it really is like the cleanest energy source out there with the least amount of impact, and isn't as controversial as, let's say, solar and wind sometimes when it comes to land usage, and even is even more sustainable than even oil and gas. So as a long-term alternative, he confides in nuclear energy, which kind of has gotten him attacks by his fellow environmentalists. But someone like him, I think, is also really interesting as well. And he's kind of emerged as a thought leader, and he sees other climate activists and other climatologists or environmentalists who kind of emerged from climate change activism, kind of stepping back away from the alarmism, still obviously pointing to the fact that you can address it, but also pointing to the fact that there are many other crises that you can attack and address without scaring the wider population. So I think many people we are starting to gravitate towards being empowered and being activated to get involved in the environment, yet they don't want to hear kind of alarmist rhetoric or defeatist rhetoric. So that is kind of what I have to say. Here's my information if you're interested in connecting with me, but I will defer to Shakira for Q&A, and I would be happy to answer any questions about what is trending in environmentalism, conservation versus preservation, and anything else you guys would like me to discuss.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ms. Gabby. So if you guys look at the top of your screen, you should see the Q&A function that just popped up. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop those in there so I can read them aloud for Ms. Gabby. In the meantime, while you guys are typing up your questions, as promised, during the registration for this event, we are having a giveaway, a beautiful, nice CFACT shirt and water bottle. I'm sorry, not water bottle, a pen, as well as a background. So basically it looks kind of what I have now as my Zoom background, kind of just something you can hang up around your room, a nice little door decorator. And yeah, so from the wheel, because unfortunately I can't do physical tickets because of COVID-19. It seems as though the winner of this is Chloe McCarthy. So Chloe, if you could just drop, you could just send me, I'll drop my email, or I know you probably already know my PIT email, but just send me your email, your address, so I can get that shipped out to you. So congratulations. Feel free to take a selfie in your CFACT shirt and everything. Also, Ms. Gabby, if you do not already have one, and if Adam didn't offer you one, I will definitely send you a CFACT t-shirt. And
they'll probably send it to me at some point.
If you would like. But yes, she is our winner for tonight. I'm seeing some questions now come in. So first, this is from Kayla Brown. Kayla says, what is the best resource for people who want to dive deeper into environmental activism?
Ooh, oh my. Well, obviously I would say CFACT would be probably one of your best outlets, but there are plenty of others that are really good too. One organization that we're kind of aligned with, but I know a lot of people there and they're like, oh, we love your work and all this. And we're really happy that you have a podcast. PERC, which is the Property and Environment Research Property Environment Research Center. Sorry, I was butchering their acronym, but they're based out of Montana and they're pretty good. And they talk about kind of market and private property rights and how that goes into conservation and stewardship. And they're really great with respect to that. We have a lot of partners at CFACT too. There's the Competitive Enterprise Institute. There are a few other organizations there. So I would say from CFACT, you can kind of open it up there and see. If you guys kind of want more like conservation-based group, I can definitely list off some names. I know a lot in the hunting and fishing space that are really good, and I'd be happy to share more, but there are so many. But I would say a good starting point would be CFACT. And if you follow my podcast, which CFACT also sponsors, sometimes I list some of our guests who are not directly aligned with us, but I bring on different types of people on to talk about what they're doing. And it's kind of nice to have people who don't always agree with you. I think that's really healthy just to have them talk about what they're up to. So even among the CFACT tab related to my podcast, District of Conservation, you'll be able to find kind of different sources and links to all the different types of, I would say, thought leaders that I really like or admire, and also kind of the news related to what's happening. I would say a good I would say objective news outlet would be E&E News. They're like energy and environment news. I think that's what they stand for. And they have like everything broken down, what's happening in government, what's happening in Senate, Congress, et cetera. So that's actually a good one too. And sometimes like Politico has like energy stories that are really good. The Washington Examiner has a morning, I would say, digest of environmental news too. So if your members need anything, I'm happy to provide all the resources. But yeah, start with CFACT, go from there, and reach out to me, and I would be more than happy to share any sources with interested people.
Awesome. And yeah, feel free to reach out to me as well. I have a whole bunch of contacts at CFACT as well if you want to get more information on how to get more involved in the program. And hey, maybe we can an event one of these days in the future. This next question is from Adam. Adam says, what is one piece of practical advice you would give to someone wanting to go about speaking up against Biden's oil policy?
Good. I mean, it shouldn't be something you shy away from. Of course, there is open comment for that right now, actually. So you could put in, and I think we had a few CFACT students put in some input into the executive order. The new Secretary of Interior just had a forum bringing on different voices from oil and gas, or those not from oil and gas, to talk about the future of that in terms of funding mechanisms for conservation funding, if there's still a use for them or there's still a purpose. But I would say commenting on the Department of Interior's website, they have public comment, I think, from now for a few more weeks. So if you have thoughts about Biden's moratorium on oil and gas. If you really want to let your perspective be heard, that's a good way. Also, another good way, in addition to submitting your comments through public options like that, is to write letters to the editors or op-eds in your local or student newspaper. That's a great way to really kind of communicate. Let's say you may work in oil and gas and you want to lend your perspective, or maybe your parents work in oil and gas and you know firsthand what will happen if they don't have the opportunity through different actions coming from the government. And if you need advice, I would be more than happy to read your articles, read your submissions, and help like edit or polish. Like that's something we can offer at CFACT too. So I've written a lot of op-eds, so I'm more than happy to lend some expertise or give it another set of eyes if there's an interest for people to do that. But I would say public comment anytime there is, through the government portals to do that, writing letters to the editors. If you want to make videos about it, I would say that's a great way to draw awareness to it, especially if you know firsthand what the impact will be. But there are many ways to be engaged, and I think those are three easy options to start with. But yeah, you can make your voice heard on social media very well, I think. And there's a lot of people who agree with you too. It's not just a minority of people, but a lot of people, I would say, are really disappointed with his moratorium and have an interest in kind of fighting back that.
Awesome. And this question is from Rachel. Rachel says, what are some of the ways people from your field are making a difference in the world? If you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, from my field. So I work more so in media and communications, but I do work with a lot of different conservation stakeholders, and I've befriended a lot of people across my years of working through my work with CFACT, lawmakers, ranchers, cattlemen, landowners, activists, people who work in the energy space. And kind of something that I've seen with them is just going to where they're working and seeing conservation at hand. So I've gone to Virginia's coal fields or well drilling site, and I've seen that they're working not only in industry, but they're also working to rehabilitate the elk population in Virginia. So you see them doing balanced use. So you see firsthand exactly what they're doing. They're making sure the strictest environmental standards are adhered to. They're making sure that the elk are growing in healthy numbers. They're making sure that people don't lose their livelihoods with these different conservation policies coming in. So you see kind of a cooperation between different interests. Everyone is happy. The environment is better. The economy stays okay, although they're going to largely feel, I think, some of the policies coming from the federal government. But pre-Biden administration, they were feeling really, really well. Let's say where else? Well, where I just returned from in Florida is really interesting. And you'll find this wherever you go, whatever state you're in. And I have no doubt in Pennsylvania and in the Northeast too, they do this as well. But in Florida, a lot of ranchers and cattlemen are actually situated in a lot of conservation easement, public areas, public waterways, public lands, state lands too. And they have to juggle those type of different aspects. So one rancher that I visited has a property, like thousands upon thousands of acres. He has an active cattle operation, and on his property too, and you guys will see this when I release my video sometime in the coming days, you'll see that he actually has a lot of like different species that live there, birds, endangered animals, a lot of alligators, and just the gamut of different things happening. And the land is replenished because of the cows that are there. He does a system where they're not worsening the land. They're trying to be good stewards of the land, and they can run the operation, have a livelihood, but also conserve species, conserve the land, and really just work to ensure, and this is kind of the greater scheme of it, that the Florida Everglades system, which is where they're kind of situated on, water quality issues are good. So you have different people who you would never think would care about, let's say, fixing the Everglades system, ensuring there's great water quality issues. You have ranchers and farmers who are active participants in it. They're not there to destroy it, because if they were to want polluted water, they wouldn't be able to be having cattle ranching operations. Their cows drink that water, or they use that water to irrigate their land. So it wouldn't make any sense for them to have poor water quality. So that's kind of another confluence that I've seen. But I think you can see different confluences around you of people who are maligned sometimes by environmentalists, and you see that they're actually having an input and they're having engagement in these different issues. So I could point you to that. I don't know if there's anyone in specificity that I would recommend, but I would say that just look around you, talk to a farmer, talk to a rancher, talk to activists, talk to people who go fishing and hunting. They're often a great source of inspiration, and they can direct you to organizations to get involved in. They can direct you to causes to support. And in Pennsylvania, there's actually a great elk herd there as well, kind of near the Marcellus Shale area, kind of to the right of that. In the center of the state, there's the Bazinet, I think is the area in Pennsylvania where elk are flourishing really well. So I think you can find people in fracking and people in oil and gas who care much about the environment and want to help, let's say, with elk regeneration efforts too. But yeah, I think just look around you, and if you need resources, like I said, I'm happy to provide them. But I think you can find someone in your neck of the woods to do it. There are different hunting and fishing organizations that do great work to preserve different species, to protect water quality issues, to ensure land is stewarded in a amenable way, and so much more. So I hope that answers the question.
Awesome. And we're at 5:50, so maybe about maybe 3 more questions. Ezekiel says, how does social and economic decisions affect environmental conclusions?
That's a good question. I think what we've seen in the past, and then what we could see emerge now, is oftentimes 2 things, especially in terms of economic costs. So whenever people have to pay more for, let's say, gas or their energy bills, there was an interesting study released by the University of Chicago, and I think it was the Associated Press. It was a UChicago poll with another polling firm. And they found that the more people would pay for their energy bills, the less interested they were in, let's say, carbon taxes or supporting different kind of preservationist climate philosophy or policies. So when you're affected directly economically, and we've seen this before, and it's not that you should have a dereliction of duty or dereliction or in terms of interest, but whenever people have to focus on you lose your job, there's also kind of this conventional wisdom that you're not going to care about the environment, or supporting certain environmental policies is going to come very behind you if your job is not there, if you have no job security. So what we were seeing, I would say, in the past administration, you saw people had greater job security. We had energy independence. A lot of people, especially, let's say, in conservative or Republican or even middle of the road circles, were starting to talk about being environmentalists, talking about being conservationists, because they had a avenue to do so. They had the ability to do so. And kind of what happens when opportunities become scarce, people lose their livelihoods, environmental agendas are kind of put on the back burner because they see that, okay, they're pushing towards this, let's say, really extreme climate policy. They're pushing towards net zero by some arbitrary deadline. How is that going to impact me if I have a family to provide for, if I'm going to have this, if I don't have basic energy sources for my car or for powering my house? They're going to put this issue on the back burner. They're going to say, I can't support this because I've lost my ability to pay for cheap oil and gas or energy or electricity, excuse me. And so I think when certain policies are there, and I would say there's a greater correlation between government interference and kind of this taxation policy. And when you see environmental policies that punish individuals, that punish free enterprise, you see kind of this lack of interest or hostility towards environmental issues. And that should never be the case, but you have to fight in terms of opposition when it comes to economic costs, making it impossible for you to care about both the environment and also the economy. So I think, like I said, I think in the Trump administration, they were working really diligently to ensure that you can have a flourishing economy, plus also care about the environment. And now we're seeing this, I would say, deviation back to kind of the status quo, where you had it so the environment gets greater priority than the environment. And that, I think, is a very wrong-headed approach. I think that's going to cause a lot of discord. It's going to make people not care about certain policies, not say they're going to litter or they're going to be really terrible towards the environment or litter or pollute or do this. No, I don't think that's the case. But people are not going to support those policies because of just the direct impact that they're having in terms of higher energy costs, higher this. People are going to be skeptical of policies. And even a poll done by Axios for swing states, they actually put that climate change was not the top priority, but not the least concerned priority either. It was kind of middle of the road as well when it came to, in general, climate activism. So when you pull people, that really wasn't, for many voters, that really wasn't the biggest concern. People care about the environment, I would say widely, but in terms of combating, let's say, like certain climate issues, that was kind of a lower totem pole issue. You really didn't see it arise. And it'll be interesting to see how public opinion weighs into that. But I think there's a correlation, and you'll see with higher energy costs, people are not going to support a lot of the environmental policies that are coming from Biden. Generally speaking, if it's like a reasonable climate policy or a reasonable energy policy, you'll see more support when it's not attacking people's livelihoods, when it's not rising their energy bill, or it's forcing them to be displaced from their industry job, or like oil or gas job, or a nuclear energy job, or whatever. But yeah, I think economic costs and social costs certainly weigh into people's decisions when supporting environmental policy. And I think you're going to see kind of skepticism or legal challenge to a lot of environmental policies being touted of the preservationist variety, because they just see it as being very imbalanced, giving government greater oversight on these issues instead of individuals and local communities and states. So you'll see, unfortunately, a shirking of interest in what is being done, because they see it as kind of running in conflict with kind of a conservationist ideology or thinking in terms of environmental stewardship. So yeah, it's a way to get people disengaged, sadly, I think. But we could still get people engaged in these issues. It has to be from a defensive standpoint, unfortunately, not from an offensive standpoint, kind of what we saw last administration. But I think we have to be a little bit optimistic, kind of half glass full in this, although we do have to deal with a lot of very bad legislation coming about, and kind of how it'll attack our livelihoods. But I would say that we can combat this, and then also still kind of on the offensive, put out great policy and get people engaged and get them involved in greater social movements.
Awesome. And lastly, this is a question from Kenneth. Kenneth says, can you explain a little more about the connection of oil to conservation, and how would you shape the narrative of the youth perspective on what Biden is doing in regards to the oil policy? And he also asks if I can elaborate a little more on the youth perspective as well. So you can go on and I can just follow up.
I'll go quickly, absolutely. Yeah, with respect to that, for sure, in terms of oil and gas. So the connection, there's quite a few. So royalties, federal royalties collected on offshore oil and gas exploration. So this is oil rigs that you see in the ocean, and I think it could extend to the wind turbines as well. But typically it's oil and gas exploration offshore. So you see these in the Gulf of Mexico. You see them sometimes on the Atlantic coast, although you see more so in Texas and Louisiana, more so than you would in Florida or the Carolinas. But there's a program called the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which was established in the 1960s. So it stipulates that in order to have different parks, different streams, different playgrounds, different kind of outdoor activities, or different infrastructure related to amenities, not infrastructure, but more so amenities for outdoor enjoyment. They tied those type of programs or different types of initiatives to get people to go outdoors and provide all these different parks and rivers and streams and hiking trails and all that. They tied it to oil and gas royalties that were collected. So anytime a major company would get into contract with the federal government, any royalties collected on their earnings, those would largely go to fund this Land and Water Conservation Fund. So if you were to stop future or existing oil and gas leases offshore, not on federal lands, but they want to stop it even on, I think, federal lands to onshore. But offshore, if you stop oil and gas exploration offshore, this fund, which was just permanently authorized, since that's the only funding mechanism right now, unless they attach something else to it, maybe user fees if you go access parks or something. But right now, as it stands, that's the only way that this program is being funded by oil and gas royalties until something else comes about, maybe something more profitable or efficient. But if you were to take away that, this fund would dry. And I don't know what would happen now that it's permanently authorized. I have to go back to the details. But if for permanent authorization and permanent funding of this, If you stop oil and gas offshore exploration, it's going to be problematic, and that fund could dry out, even though it did secure enough funding. But I think there was a mechanism attached to it where you still have to develop offshore oil and gas. But I will correct the record if I'm incorrect on that detail. But it is hinging on offshore oil and gas exploration right now until they find something else. But if they were to stop it, they would stop one of the most successful environmental programs in the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is not really that controversial. Sometimes some of the funds are mismanaged, and that's what this bill tried to address. It wasn't perfect, but with the Great American Outdoors Act, we did see permanent funding of this, and we also saw the reduction of National Park Service backlog across all the different agency lands of the Department of Interior also addressed. So yeah, with respect to that Land and Water Conservation Fund, Google that, you'll find all the different details about it, but it says clearly that without oil and gas royalties collected by the federal government, that program would cease to exist. So that's one way you can, I think, combat people and say, well, look at this successful program and look what funds it. And let's say you take away oil and gas offshore exploration, that funding dries up. So you have evidence right there. It's from both left or right sources, middle of the road. It's pretty clear as to it. But to get people involved in oil and gas, I think from a standpoint, you can say not only from the kind of like economic component, but you could also say like today, the way that these sources are refined is a lot cleaner than, let's say, the 1970s, 1980s. There's a lot of evidence pointing to that. Many people are employed in oil and gas. You could say, find the statistics of how many people are employed in each state or nationally in terms of this. A lot of natural gas companies have talked about how their companies tout zero emissions, how it's much cleaner even than like oil. And you can find different kind of economic sources from it. But I think you also can make the argument that if you stop with oil and gas and you phase that out completely, does that mean all the byproducts that are made from petroleum have to go too? I think that's another moral argument you can make is, when does it stop? Does it mean we have to cut our reliance not only from energy consumption? Does it mean stopping, and I'm using a Mac computer, does it mean no more minerals for cell phones? Does it mean no more oil and gas byproducts for, let's say, like plastic stuff too, and like makeup? Like so many things we rely on are byproducts of oil and gas. And to see that disappear, I think you can make that greater argument even beyond, let's say, energy consumption. I think that has to be the moral argument made. Like, when does it stop? And we can say, well, looking at other countries, they're developing oil and gas still. So why do we have to stop doing it? If other countries are doing it and they're refining it in a cleaner fashion, I think we can make that argument. But yeah, I think there's a way to say it from the economic standpoint, from a moral standpoint, and kind of from a big picture standpoint. Like, there's still a need. It's cheaper for people to use oil and gas because a lot of these new emerging technologies, although they're being touted as clean energy sources, they're still backed up by oil and gas too. That's something I forgot to mention. You can't have a wind turbine without backups from oil and gas. Same with solar. You have a lot of these different traditional energy sources powering it up. And like I had mentioned in my lecture, to build and construct solar panels, we're relying on minerals from China. And they don't want to develop any more or have any more mineral extractive type of avenue or settings in the United States. People are refusing to refine and mine for minerals here because they just oppose it wholly and don't see a need to have it. But they want to rely on China for those minerals, despite their various different human rights abuses, their lack of environmental standards compared to us. So you can point out kind of the hypocrisies with it, the costs associated with transitioning, obviously the long-term effects that it has, not only in energy consumption, but also basic conveniences, because a dissolution of oil and gas means we'll have to kind of go back to the caveman era, and we don't want to do that. So Shakira, I'll let you chime in on that as well.
Yeah, and mine's just like very brief. I agree with everything that Ms. Gabby said. I am definitely worried about Biden's ban on new oil and gas leases on, the federal lands and waters. I think that, funds from the sales of these leases, they go to many important projects, including funding for our national parks, like you were mentioning, from offshore oil and gas royalties and things of that nature. And just like our national park system already has, a backlog of, what is it, like 12 billion in repair for work needed. So this will be helped by the recent Great American Outdoors Act, but only providing just over a half of the funds needed. So we shouldn't be making it harder to fund these important projects to, protect our nation's environment. I just think that's pointless. And while it may seem like banning leases for oil and gas is an environmental friendly move, it will actually increase our reliance on big polluters abroad and hurt our already struggling national parks. So as a young person, I just wish we would do better for our environment and just like reverse this ban because America.